In this section, we're going to be focusing on permanent data storage. So looking at a number of different ways of storing data permanently in your app. We'll also, of course, be building a couple of real apps to try that out, including a Notes app and a Newsreader app. We're going to start with the most simple way to store data permanently, and that's using something called shared preferences. So I'm going to start a new project for this. So shared preferences, as is implied by the name, is a way of storing just very simple, short items of data. So ideally just strings like a username or indeed a preference that the user has selected for your app. So we're going to see how to use shared preferences to store and restore data. And finally, we're going to complete the Memorable Places app by adding permanent storage to it using shared preferences. Shared preferences is great for storing just little bits of information, but if you want to start storing lots of information, such as a selection of emails or tweets or something like that, then there are better ways to do it using databases, which we'll look at later on in this section. Okay, here we go. So this is our shared preferences app. I'm in mainactivity.java. I'm going to start writing code in here straight off. So to use shared preferences, we create a variable of a type shared preferences. We'll call it shared preferences. And we create this from the context, so from the main activity. So we use this dot get shared preferences. And then we have to give the name of the app. So fortunately, it's saved for us up there where it says package. So I just copy and paste that right in. And then we need to give a context. And we want only our app to access this data. So we're going to use mode private. That will mean that only our app can access the data that we're saving here. It is possible to share bits of data between apps using shared preferences, but usually we just want to save it and then get some information back about our app. Okay, I'll just run it in the background while we're going. Now to save an item in shared preferences, we use our shared preferences variable, and then we want to edit the shared preferences. And you can see we can put a range of variable types in, but these are the only variable types that we can save. So for now, we'll put a string, and then we give a name for the variable. So I'll call this username, and then a value for the variable. So for example, Rob. And then to the end of that command, we put the instruction apply. And that will do the saving process for us. And then to get it back, we'll create a string called username to store our username. And then we just use shared preferences dot get string. And then we give the name of the variable that we want to get. And we also give a default value. So if there isn't a username saved, even though we know that there is, if there isn't one, then the default value here is just going to be an empty string. So just like we did with the put extra and the get int extra in the previous section, we put a default value that we'll get if our value doesn't exist. And then we'll just log the results so we can see it in action. So I'll call it username and then username. So let's run the app and take a look at the logs. And here we go. And you can see there that the username Rob has indeed been restored from shared preferences. Just to prove that that has indeed been stored permanently, I'm going to jump over to the app and shut it down by double tapping on the square and closing down the app. And then I'm going to comment out the part of the code that saves the string in shared preferences, and then we'll just run it again and we should get exactly the same result, which will prove that the username in shared preferences was stored permanently. And here we go. You can see it right there once again. Brilliant. So that's more or less all there is to saving items with shared preferences. But I did mention at the end of the last section that the challenge here was going to be converting our Memorable Places app to permanent storage using shared preferences. That's going to be a bit tougher than just saving a string because we want to save our array lists permanently. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and then I'll give you the challenge of updating Memorable Places to store data permanently. So first off, I'm just going to comment out the code that we've got so far, and then we'll create an array list to save. So this will be called friends, which should be familiar. And then, as before, we'll add Monica and Chandler, and we'll just leave it there. We only really need two to prove our point. Now you will have noticed that shared preferences are limited with the types of data that we can store. So one option is to convert our data into a string set, but the problem with that is we lose the order of the data, which is important to us. So I'm going to do a process called serialization, which is a bit like converting something to JSON. It essentially converts it to a string so that we can save it as a string in shared preferences. To do that, I'm going to import a new class. This is something we haven't done before, so it's a good thing to see. So we're going to import a new Java class, and this is going to be called Object Serializer. And Object Serializer is a standard class provided by Apache, but I've made a very slightly edited version which just works slightly smoother with Android. And you can get that at androiddevcourse.com/objectserializer.html. If you want to see the original, then just Google Object Serializer Java and it'll pop right up. You can see that mine is very similar. I've just changed the exceptions really to work with Android Studio. So we're then going to delete everything here in this class apart from the package name at the top and then paste it all in. That should work absolutely fine. Now we've got this class, I'm not going to worry about what the code is doing precisely. Essentially, it's just converting our array list into a string. So now we can edit our shared preferences and put a string again. And this time I'll call the string friends. And the string that we're going to save is object serializer dot serialize, and then we're going to serialize the object friends. And then as before, we'll apply that. Now this is something that could fail, so we're going to surround it by try and catch. And then we need to try and restore that into a new array list. So let's do that down here. So we'll create a new array list of strings, which I'll call new friends. So initially that'll just be an empty array list. And then we're going to set it equal to, and this is where we're going to bring our data back from shared preferences. And we're going to use the object serializer, and this time we're going to deserialize, i.e. we're going to convert it from a string to our array list object. And the thing that we want to deserialize is what we saved earlier. So that's shared preferences, get string, and friends. And then we need to have a secondary string. So we could leave it as an empty string, but the problem with that is if we do actually get no response from our shared preferences, then trying to deserialize an empty string will give us an error. So I'm going to create a serialized empty array list. So we'll use object serializer.serialize, and then we'll just create a new array list of strings. Just like that. So that looks slightly confusing, but all we're really doing is we're creating a new serialized empty array list, so that then if we get an error over here, we're going to deserialize that serialized array list, which will just create an empty array list. Make sense? Hopefully so. We've got the same issue as before, that we need to surround it with try and catch in case it fails. And also this time, this will return just a generic object, so we need to cast it to an array list of strings. There we go. And then we'll log new friends, and we'll convert it to a string so it can be logged. And we should see then the results come back. So that's a slightly fiddly process. We're converting to a string using the object serializer, and then we're converting back again. I seem to have an error somewhere. Yes, I've forgotten a semicolon. So if we just check that this works, we should now find that it saves the array list friends in a serialized form and then brings it back, deserializes it, and logs it as an array list. And there it is. You just see it jump past. Fantastic. Monica and Chandler, you can see it's in the same order, which is what we want. And again, let's convince ourselves that if I comment out the part of the code that saves that array list, I still get the result, and that will mean that it's saved permanently. And there it is. Wonderful. So again, it's a bit of a faff, but it does the job, and generally being able to convert objects to strings is useful in a number of different circumstances, so it's worth being aware of the object serializer. All right, now though, it's the big challenge for this video. So we'll go back over to memorable places, and your challenge is to add permanent storage to the memorable places app. Best of luck, go for it. All right, here we go then. So I'm going to start by adding my new object serializer Java class. And I'm going to paste in that code so I can use the object serializer. And then let's think about the two places that we're going to need to use permanent storage. So one is when we're getting the data back at the beginning of the onCreate method in the main activity. And the other is where we're saving items at the bottom of the maps activity. So I'm going to start by saving items. So let's begin by using shared preferences. So we'll create a variable again called shared preferences, which is going to be created from this activity. And we're going to get shared preferences for the app package com.rotpercival.memorableplaces. Your package name will probably be different. And then we'll use private mode again, so that only our app can access the data. And then To save the places array list, we'll use shared preferences .edit .put string, and we'll save it as places, and then we'll use the object serializer to serialize the data, and the data that we want to serialize is main activity .places. Then we'll add in our try catch, and don't forget the apply at the end. Easily done. Saving the locations is a little bit trickier because they are saved as lat.longs, which we can't save in shared preferences. So we're going to convert those to strings and save them separately as latitudes and longitudes. So to do that, we're going to loop through. So we're looking for lat.longs, which I'll call coordinates, and we're looking for all the coordinates in main activity dot locations. Then we're going to create separate array lists for each, for latitudes and longitudes. So let's do that. We've got latitudes, which is a new array list. And same for longitudes. And then for each of the lat.longs, we'll take latitudes and add, and we want to add coordinates dot latitude, but we need to convert that to a string. So we'll use double dot to string to do that. And same for longitudes. So longitudes add, and we want to use coordinates dot longitude this time, but we still want to convert it to a string. There we go. So now we can use our shared preferences again, and this time I'll just copy and paste. So we're putting latitudes, and this time we want to serialize the latitudes variable, and then longitudes will be called longitudes. All right, so now everything should be saved permanently. We now just need to restore it from the permanent storage. So let's set up our shared preferences again. Call it shared preferences. We're pretty familiar with this by now. So this dot get shared preferences, and then the package name, and then context.mode private, and we'll start with places. So we'll set places equal to, and now we're restoring, so we'll use object serializer dot deserialize shared preferences dot get string, and the string we want to get is places. And the backup, as before, will be a serialized empty string or empty array list. There we go. Don't forget the semicolon. And let's add in our try catch. And finally, of course, we need to convert that to an array list of strings. All right, so that's fine for places, but for the slightly trickier locations, we're going to need to create new array lists for latitudes. And also for longitudes. Okay, so let's copy our places code. And then we'll set latitudes. And this is all going to be exactly the same, except we're looking for the latitudes object in shared preferences. And same for longitudes. Okay. We're nearly there. So now we're going to check to see if we've actually got some data here from permanent storage, because it might be that they haven't saved anything yet. So if places.size is greater than 0 and latitudes.size is greater than 0 and longitudes.size is greater than 0, that means we have some data. Now there is a very small chance that something's gone wrong and we don't have the same number of places, latitudes and longitudes. If that's the case, our app is definitely going to give some errors at some point. So I'm going to do a check to see if places.size is equal to latitudes.size and latitudes.size is equal to longitudes.size, and only then will we process everything. Otherwise, we might well try and create a location for something where we've only got a latitude for some reason. Not that that should ever happen, but it's always good to check for these things. So if this is the case, then all is well. So we're going to loop through both latitudes and longitudes. The easiest way to do that is to use a for loop with a counter variable I starting at 0 and going until we get to latitudes size, which is of course the same as places size and longitude size. Adding 1 to I each time. And then we want to take locations and add to it a new lat_long, and we're going to create that from latitudes get I and longitudes get I, so the ith item in each of those. But of course these are both strings, so we're going to need to convert them to doubles, which we do using double pass double. There we go. Now a final thing to check, or to do really, is initially to set places as well as latitudes and longitudes, and indeed locations, to empty array lists. Just in case some items are already saved there, we don't want to restore these items and put them on top of what's already saved. We want to essentially start from scratch each time. Okay, if of course there aren't any places saved, then we want to do what we did before, which is to add this initial place in there. All right then. So let's give it a go. Essentially, there are two things to learn there. One is how to use shared preferences to store data permanently within a reasonably complex app, but another is also that shared preferences is not necessarily the ideal solution. And we'll use shared preferences in our first big app of this section, which will be a note-taking app, but we won't use it later on, and we'll see the advantages and disadvantages of shared preferences versus databases, which we'll see how to use later on. And here we go. I've actually cheated slightly, and you can see that everything's working because I've already saved a new place. But let's just prove it to ourselves. So we'll add a new place. Let's go for Biggleswade this time. So long press, and then that will save that location. And we've got a nice address there as well. So going back, okay, it's displaying it there. That's great, but we want to be sure that it saved it permanently. So a double tap on the square, and then we'll close down the app and then run it again from Android Studio. And with any luck, we'll see that those two items now have been saved permanently. And there they are. Fantastic. Of course, if I click on that one, then it will take me to that particular location in the lovely town of Biggleswade. Brilliant. So now we have permanent storage in our Memorable Places app, but do bear in mind that it wasn't that straightforward. And if I wanted to do anything more complicated with my permanent storage, it would probably be a bit of a nightmare. So we're going to start by seeing how good shared preferences can be for an app like Notes app, and then we'll go on and look at databases as an alternative. Before we build our Notes app though, we're going to see two new features that are useful in all sorts of different Android apps. Firstly, you'll see how to customize the action bar, and then we'll see how to use pop-ups or alert dialogues in our apps. We'll start with customizing the action bar in the next video.